So on our final exam review, the very first set of questions, which is actually number 1, it's a sequence of 3 questions, is asking us to write the equation for the inverse of the relation. So we're basically looking for the inverse function. Now, if you remember what we talked about with inverse functions or an inverse relation, basically when something is an inverse, when you have an inverse function, that means that your domain and range switch. So that's what an inverse is. The domain and the range switch. So what we're looking at here is how can we find the function that represents the function that has the reversed domain and range, the function that has the domain of this function as its range and the range of this function as its domain. So what we're going to do first is we are going to replace f of x with y. It's the same thing. Y f of x. The reason we write f of x is because we're indicating that it is a function of x. Y is your dependent variable. It depends on x. It is a function of x. So that's why we can use the two different representations. So I'm going to write y equals x minus 3 squared minus 4. So now I'm ready. Now if you remember, domain and range, let's come back over here. X is your domain, and y, the y values are your range. X is your input, y is your output. So when we're looking at this function here, x is our domain and y is our range. We want to know what's the function where these are switched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the y and the x, and I'm going to switch them. So that's going to be x equals y minus 3 squared minus 4. All I've done is I've switched the x and the y. First step. My next step is going to be to try to solve for x. So what we're going to do first is we're going to add the 4 to both sides. I'm not going to add the 4 to the minus 3. You can't do that. The minus 3 is inside the parentheses and it's squared. This is added on to this whole thing, or subtracted, so I'm going to add it. So that'll leave me with x plus 4 equals y minus 3 squared. Pencil's kind of getting a little ugly there. Okay. So now what do I do to get rid of the squared? Well, inverse relation, inverse operation of squaring is square root. So I'm going to do the inverse operation, and that's going to leave me with plus or minus square root of x plus 4 equals y minus 3. Because when I take the square root of y minus 3 squared, the square root and the squared are inverse. They cancel. So I've got y minus 3. And remember, anytime you take the square root of a number, it has a positive and a negative case. For example, if I took the square root of 9, that's going to be plus or minus 3. Why can it be either? Well, what's 3 squared? Positive 9. What's negative 3 squared? Positive 9. So I can have a positive or a negative. Same here, positive or negative x plus 4. Then I'm going to take one more step, and I'm going to move the 3. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. I cannot add the 3 to the 4. The 4 is underneath the radical. The 3 is not. You cannot combine those. Just like up here, you cannot combine that 4 and that 3. So I'm going to move that out in front. So it's going to be 3 plus or minus the square root of x plus 4 equals y. That is your inverse relation. So that's your inverse function. So let's look at the second example in number 1. And we'll call this part A because that's A. That's the first one. Okay? So now let's look at B, the second part of number 1. And the second part of number 1 is f of x equals 2 times x plus 5 squared minus 50. So we're going to follow the same process, the same procedure, same steps. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to change the f to a y. So I'm going to have y equals 2 times x plus 5 squared minus 50. Okay, once I do that, I'm going to switch my x and my y now. So these two guys, domain and range, are going to switch places. So x equals 2y plus 5 squared minus 50. Okay? So moving on from there, I'm going to take the 50 and move that first, that plus 50. I can't combine it with 5. 5's inside the parentheses. This is not. And I'm going to add the 50 to both sides. So it's going to give me x plus 50 equals 2 times y plus 5 squared. Okay? So what do I do with my next step? Well, I've got that 2 out in front, so I can divide both sides by 2. Now what's that going to create for me? There's two different ways you can write this. I can separate this out and write it as x over 2 plus 50 over 2, which is 25. Or I can leave it like this. I'm going to change it to 25 equals y plus 5 squared. Okay? Next thing you're going to do is we are going to take the square root of both sides. So to take the square root of both sides, square root of this side, square root of this side, you're going to end up with y plus 5 because the square root and squared are inverse relations. They're inverse operations. They're going to cancel. And then we're going to end up with, again, the plus and minus case, positive and negative case of x over 2 plus 25. That's an equal sign right there. So I do have one step left. I need to move that 5. It's a positive 5, so I'm going to subtract it. I cannot combine it with what's under the radical because it's not under the radical. So I have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of x over 2 plus 25 equals y. So that is my inverse relation, or my inverse function for b. So let's do the last one. Let's do c. So we're going to move back up here to the other side of the paper. And there we go. And we're going to do c. c is f of x equals negative 3 x plus times x plus 4 squared plus 18. So what's our first step? Change the f of x to y. So y equals negative 3 x plus 4 squared plus 18. Now I'm ready to do my switch of my domain and range. So I'm going to take the x and y and swap. So that becomes x. That becomes y. And then after that, I'm going to move the 18. So the 18 being moved is going to be the first step. So I'm going to take minus 18, minus 18. Don't touch the 4. The 4 is inside. Leave it alone. That cancels. I've got x minus 18 on this side and negative 3 y plus 4 squared on this side. So for my next step, I'm going to divide both sides by that negative 3. Don't touch the 4. We're just looking on what's on the outside. So everything gets divided by negative 3, all the terms. So this leaves me with negative x over 3, which is the same thing as negative 1/3 x, however you want to write it, plus 6, because you have a negative over negative, equals y plus 4 squared. So after that, I want to get rid of the squared, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Okay, take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to end up with y plus 4 on this side. The inverse relations cancel. And plus or minus square root of negative x over 3 plus 6 on this side. And my last step is going to be subtract 4. So I'm going to subtract the 4 from both sides. Again, don't combine the 4 with what's under the radical. You can't do that. The negative 4 is just going to go out in front. So it's negative 4 plus or minus negative x over 3 plus 6 equals y. And this is your inverse relation. So that's how you find the inverse function of a function. You switch the x and y, and you solve for y.